Okay, good to go.
Hi, I'm not sure how I feel about following a professor who's speaking on journalism and now coming and speaking on journalism, but I will do my best. I want to talk today about the trickiness of defining journalism. I am a first-year PhD candidate. I am previously a practicing journalist, and so I'm doing my PhD in media studies, and I'm particularly interested in the impacts of digitization on journalism. 5 years ago, I was at Carleton University doing my master's, and when I was there, these questions, what is journalism, who is a journalist, what should journalists be doing, never really came up in a concrete way, which feels like it sounds crazy, but we had this inherent sense. My colleagues and I, it was a professional program, not a theoretical program, and we had a sense of what journalist was. It was kind of a case of, you know it when you see it. And so it was never a question that I necessarily asked myself. I read about journalism theory in that context, but I don't know, it more confirmed what I thought than brought up questions. But then I went out into the real world. And so I spent a couple of years reporting. I first reported at a small newspaper in Olds, and then I moved to Moncton, New Brunswick as a bilingual reporter. And I love journalism. I love the idea of journalism, but the practice of journalism was frustrating. And I found myself regularly ask myself why I was doing what I was doing, and I'd be assigned kind of stories that didn't make sense to me. You know, I'd be asked to go chase a CBC story. CBC had already written the story. They'd already interviewed all the people. Because I worked for a different publication, I was sent to kind of duplicate that story, and it didn't make sense to me. Or I'd be asked to kind of recap the agenda of an upcoming town council meeting when all that information was already available online. So why was I duplicating it? And I regularly got into theoretical discussions, pardon me, with my editors about why I was doing these assignments. And so now I'm here doing a PhD instead to figure out the answer. I'll start here. So this is the eminent Mr. McQuail, who says that journalism is a social and cultural phenomenon that can ultimately escapes clear and unambiguous definition, which kind of, I guess I could just end my presentation there and call it a day. But this paper that I started, or this presentation today, comes out of my media theory class last semester, and it comes out of looking at the Canadian Association of Journalists definition of journalism. They had defined it in 2012, and they were in the middle of redefining it. And because I'm a member of the association, I was privy to some of the discussion around it. And this got me thinking a lot and kind of exploring this question of what is journalism. And there is, it took me less than a week into my PhD to discover there is no shortage of theory about journalism. There's theories about whether it's a profession or an activity or an industry or an ideology. It was the first time I'd heard it called a literary genre. There are kind of poetic ways of describing it as the literature of civic life. Complex social systems, there's always these kind of tropes about holding power to account or being a gatekeeper or shining a light in the dark. While you're kind of mucking through all this, especially because I'd already spent several years as a working journalist, never really having asked these questions with any great intention, and I'm not sure that it held me back. At the end of all this, I kind of asked myself, well, does it matter? The Canadian Association of Journalists makes some compelling arguments about why it does matter to define journalism. And one of the first ones is this question about guaranteed press freedoms. And we've seen this a little bit in BC, often around pipeline issues and journalists or documentarians being arrested while they're doing their jobs. And the question of who is and who is not a journalist might apply in a situation like that. Another situation are issues of access. This can be access to the parliamentary press gallery, for example, or access to getting a media pass or getting court proceedings. The federal courts of Canada, for example, allow members of the media to record what's going on in court. So this would bring up a question of who is media. There are also questions of shield laws. This is the Journalistic Source Protection Act that came out in 2017, which allows journalists to protect their sources and not to divulge their sources. And so, but it applies specifically to journalists. And then lastly, as you start to read more about kind of academic considerations of journalism, there are academic considerations about why we should define it. It's necessary kind of conceptually, but also practically to be able to evaluate how journalism is being practiced and to kind of evaluate that quality and maybe assess whether what's being practiced is how it should be practiced. It's nice to say, well, oh, there's all this exploration about all these different definitions of journalism, but ultimately, kind of at the end of the day, it's semantics and who cares. But there are actually practical issues about why it does matter. And so I started to break down a paper exploring what is the definition of journalism, what is kind of the theoretical backgrounds to it, how has it been defined, what is changing, and that's what I'm going to take you through a little bit today. There are two kind of general ways, two broad categories of defining journalism. One is typically along the lines of an activity of collecting and disseminating information. And the second, and becoming more prevalent, is this idea of providing that same collection and disseminating information, but providing it in order for people to be able to make decisions. I'm not going to read these all to you, but these are definitions that have been published, more particularly in scholarship. And when we're talking about collecting and disseminating information, you typically hear words like information and news media, and gathering it and collecting it and transmitting it and disseminating it. So these are the words that kind of like pop up in those kinds of definitions. That second one that's becoming more prevalent is this idea of providing information for making decisions. And in that context, you often hear ideas about citizenship or government or communities and society, a little bit more about like knowledge and understanding as opposed to information and facts, deciding and organizing. So often you can kind of group a definition that you come across into one of those two buckets. You'll also see, in response to some of those more technical issues, those issues of access, those issues of shield laws, that there are legal terms and legal definitions or definitions provided by particular organizations that are very specific about what a journalist is. I provide these just kind of so you can see that. And I think this is that previous one was this is the definition for the Journalistic Source Protection Act, so a legal Canadian definition. This one, though, I'll point to, this is the access to the parliamentary press gallery, and it's very specific that you must be a professional. It has to be your principal occupation. You must be reporting, but specifically reporting on parliamentary issues. You need to be assigned to Ottawa. So there's a whole compendium of the kind of terms here that fall under their definition, but I would say that is distinct from this question of what is a journalist in a more academic sense or in a scholarly sense. And let me finally point you to the Canadian Association of Journalists definition, because it doesn't fall really into any of these categories. And this is what piqued my interest to begin with, is that this definition, I'm not sure that I would call it a definition. It has a lot of different components that are pulled from a lot of different kinds of theories. And this is kind of what pushed me to go explore those theories. And the Canadian Association of Journalists split it up into these three kind of defining features of journalism: that there's a disinterested purpose, this act of creating something, and then doing that according to a particular set of methods. I'm not going to like expound on every single theoretical underpinning of journalism, but I'll kind of give you the broad scope in the evolution that led to a lot of the definitions that we have today. The first being kind of original social theory, and that journalism is this activity that responds to our societies and that changes as we go along. Sociological theory, kind of Durkheimian, in that it's that journalists and their activity contributes to the greater good of society. And there are often a lot of kind of social functions served by journalism that are outlined that look kind of like this. Maintaining social order and integrating and cohesion of society, allowing people to express their public opinions, and the like. Free press theory is now, it's kind of like the main theological driver behind a lot of how we conceive of journalism now, and is considered a human right at this point. And in Canada, that is our second fundamental right to freedom, so our freedom of thought and of opinion, of belief, and specifically the freedom of the press. And our ability to publish information freely. This kind of led to this idea of the fourth estate. One, free press theory kind of bundled journalism and the press, the media, into our social system in such a concrete way that people started to consider it as the fourth estate, alongside our three other executive, legislative, and judicial branches of the government. Theory of the public sphere is often kind of an underpinning theory behind journalism, and this kind of metaphorical space where people can dialogue about the governing of their society. This led into social responsibility theory in the 1940s and questioning the privileges that mainstream media had, and thinking about those privileges as conditional on their providing the functions that they are getting those privileges for. And lastly, this kind of became spun into a little bit more criticism in the 1960s about this assumption of that privileged position of journalism in society. So you can read for the rest of your life about all of these kind of underpinnings of journalism, but these are the things that kind of help form a lot of those definitions that we just looked at. But as you start to break those things down, what you discover, and as you start to really try and create a cohesive kind of understanding of journalism, you discover all of these terms that come up, purposes and values and goals and tasks and functions, and leads you to another problem, which is the question of defining these things. What constitutes a value, and what constitutes a function, and what is a task, and how do all those things shake out? This led me to, in one of my readings, a sociological definition of the word function as like this loose definition that describes practices, services, or objectives. It's a very loose idea, but it actually served my purposes really well, because I've been kind of struck by this idea that the way to understand journalism is to break it down into these three kind of operational dimensions. The question of why does journalism exist? And these are kind of these high-level objective or purposes. The second question of what do journalists do? The third question of how do journalists do it? And I think that often in a lot of these definitions, these things kind of get mixed up in ways that make it hard to understand what exactly journalists are supposed to be doing and why they're supposed to be doing it. And I think we often confound how they do it with some of those other questions. And so as I looked through and did my research, I started to kind of categorize that research under these three categories. The first question being that of why. These are often those high level kind of poetic things you hear about journalism as supporting democratic institutions, or protecting human rights, or shining a light into the darkness, or giving a voice to the voiceless. They aren't particular to journalism. You could accomplish them in other ways, but they are this kind of high level motivation that drive them. The question of what journalists do is probably where you'll find the most research, and I'm going to point to the Worlds of Journalism study, which outlined 18 kind of predetermined rules of journalism. They're all here, but these are kind of make the bridge between those high level objectives of giving a voice to the voiceless, and then those really nuanced tasks of doing a podcast or writing a story. And so these are questions of kind of providing information, or influencing public opinion, or supporting government policy. This is the Worlds of Journalism study, but you can find this kind of breakdown about these rules of journalism in a lot of other places. Sorry, this is still the Worlds of Journalism study, in identifying all those rules, and then doing surveys with journalists worldwide. There was like 27,000 journalists, I believe. They kind of broke up people's understanding of those roles into these 6 classic roles. This idea of a journalist as an informer, a reporter, a watchdog, an investigator, a monitor, and or an educator. You might fulfill all or some of these roles. And then they also broke them up along these dimensions: monitoring, collaborating, intervening, and accommodating. Again, this isn't necessarily about like understanding what the nuance of every single one of these roles, but distinguishing these kind of 3 dimensions of journalism. And so lastly, I wanted to point to the how, because often what you see in definitions are the hows of what journalists are doing. You must be reporting on the Canadian government. You must be writing a story or doing video or making a radio piece. So the how is about the skills and the mediums, the activities, the tools, all of these kind of technical things that allow you to fulfill those roles of disseminating information or being a watchdog. These are often grouped together in, there's a couple different scholars that are grouped together into these 4 tasks. The first is collecting information. The second is processing that information. So either analyzing it or writing or transcribing, and then providing context to that information. So kind of piecing it all together, and then publicizing it. We often think of this in terms of like a news article or a TV story or a radio story, but these tasks apply to any other variety of disseminating information. And then I'm going to throw one more log on the fire, because there's this other dimension of journalism which circles around values and principles and ethics, and often gets grouped in with definitions as well. But it's not necessarily about what journalism is or how you do it. It's the principles that govern those practices. And in that Worlds of Journalism study, they actually stripped out all of these kind of subjective ethical principles and standards when they were conceiving of what a role is. But you typically see them break up along 4, I'm going to go back one, along these 4 kind of broad groups. This pursuit of truth, to be able to pursue that truth with freedom and independence, that you are doing that in service of society and kind of an equity for all people to have a voice, and that you're doing it in service of democracy and this kind of pursuit of kind of social cohesion. So these four kind of overlying standards normally shake out in most journalistic standards and practices or codes of ethics that you'll see, and these are examples of the CAJ's code of kind of principles of ethics, the CBC's, and then the Society of Professional Journalists in the States. You can see that those 4 dimensions are reflected a lot in all of these. Okay, that's all the theoretical underpinnings, and my kind of last section is, well, we have all this thinking about journalism, and it's been clearly put through the ringer and thought about again. Why can't we just leave it at that? There's a theory for everyone to pull from. There's a lot of sense behind these theories. So, you know, pick a definition and run with it. Of course, the problem here is digitization and the impacts that digitization has had on how journalism is practiced, and I would argue have on how journalism is defined. So we've gone from this activity that used to require industrial machinery and a fixed product to this activity that has increased kind of individual freedoms and individual access to different means, and that is very responsive. This is Jarvis, this is a particular area of interest of mine, is this loss of monopoly. Digitization has caused this loss of monopoly for the media industry over the control of resources of production and then the control of distributing that information. And so when we now find ourselves in a world where anyone can gather and distribute information, and everyone is connected to everyone in a way that facilitates that distribution. And then we've also gone from this place where journalists were an unavoidable link, whether you liked them or not. They were unavoidable in this information chain to unavoidable link. You can skip them. So we've gone from this journalist as like a provider of facts to starting and needing to start to think of journalists as providers of meaning. And lastly, there are quite a few kind of contemporary journalism theories around hybridity and around meta-journalistic discourse. I think the one that's quite kind of the most interesting when we're talking about the definition of journalism is this post-industrial model of the news, as in there is no more journalism industry. There is no standardized career path that gets you into that industry. The tools and the templates of how you do the work are different. Not only different from how they were, but different in each job that you move to. There's no stable kind of employees or employment path. That everything demands kind of flexible and responsive skills. So you can't even say, well, these are the 5 skills I need to do this particular job. Even the skills that you need in that particular job change for that same job at a different organization. And so this takes me to this last idea of moving beyond journalism. And this is Deutz and Wichtige, who argue that kind of this post-industrial model, we've now moved into this world that is beyond journalism, that we have to look at journalism as a dynamic object of study, that it's permanently unstable, and there are no hard definitions, and even further, there are no soft definitions of what journalism is. My last thought is that all sounds very kind of fatalistic, and especially if you're trained as a journalist, you might kind of read it as doom and gloom, and it feeds into this kind of narrative of crisis. But I think that, and a lot of these scholars, and even I think within the industry, people are starting to see the potential in rethinking journalism and those possibilities. And this is kind of a list or a laundry list of how different scholars have conceived of where we can go when we think of journalists as publishers, when we think of them as service providers, not content creators, meaning providers, that they are kind of conductors and brokers and providers within this sense of like social consensus and social cohesion. But those are not how we conceive of broadly, and even still, of what a journalist is. And so all that to say, you know, journalist kind of escapes clear and unambiguous definition. And I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Michelle, for this amazing presentation. I saw a lot of nods on the audience.
Sorry, I have to figure out how to stop sharing everything.
Does anyone have a question? Oh, we have many hands raised. So first, who raised their hand? Was Professor Isaac Nahom Sarfati.
Yeah, all right, thank you. Thank you for a very good, very interesting presentation. And as you can see, if you were there when Professor Marc-François Bernier did his presentation, I'm always interested in this kind of reflection about the role of journalism, or even the definition of journalism. There is one aspect, there is one thing I would like to hear your opinion or your view on this, which is, you know, Professor Marc-François Bernier said that you have 2 kinds of journalism. One that is important because, you know, all the social, political implications, and one that is less important, but it's there. Some kind of soft journalism. He used the metaphor of gasoline, you know, saying, you know, you have a certain kind of journalism that helps to really keep the social engine going on, and there is another one that, you know, is there, but it's not that important. But I think if we look at the different forms of journalism, of the different ways of conceiving journalism, the question of emotion and aesthetics is becoming more and more important in our society. The way we judge or we perceive certain things is based on our emotions, on even a certain kind of aesthetic judgment, regarding, for example, I'm more and more interested in the role of images and the way images either convey a certain idea of the beautiful or even the opposite. I'm more interested in the opposite than the beautiful in my own research. I mean, the opposite being the grotesque, the horrific, etc. Then I would like to know your view on this. I mean, what's the role, or how we can approach journalism in terms of the emotions and in terms of the aesthetics? If you have any idea about that, anything to say about these two aspects of journalism?
I think there's two distinct things here. The first thing, when you said kind of there's these two different groups of journalism. One, I think we would call civic journalism, this journalism that kind of supports democracy and our social cohesion, social institutions. And then the second, which is often kind of like entertainment or fashion journalism, or it's still distribution of information, although many people argue we can get that information from a lot of different places now. And does it matter? You know, even a lot of it is automated. Let's take, for example, hockey stats. And I'll give you an interesting example of kind of this blurring line, because you could, for example, get your hockey statistics from an automated source after the game. We don't need a journalist to do that anymore. We used to need a journalist to compile all the stats, and put the agate in the paper and publish it, because otherwise no one would know that information. That information is now available in automated forms. Do we need journalists to do that? And there's questions of, yeah, so an interesting consideration though is, for example, what happens when those statistics are wrong? I had a friend in sports and sports information who had discovered that the number of people who had attended a game had been reflected in the wrong way. It was the wrong number. That doesn't seem like a big question, until he learned that the reason the number had been reflected wrong was because there was a capacity issue that was related to COVID and the number of people that they were allowed to have in. This is starting to become not just a question of like how many people went to the hockey game, but questions of operations of our society, of truth, of the work that journalists do. So and you can find examples of that would apply in fashion journalism and entertainment journalism, kind of this where we cross away from the TV listings into questions that are more about truth and crime and social governance and equity. So there's that question about these different types of journalism. The question of aesthetics, and I think you're saying, I'm not, let me clarify, are you asking about the aesthetics of the journalism itself?
Well, let me just introduce here a very current topic, the debate between Neil Young and Spotify. Okay, are you aware of the debate?
No, I'm not.
Neil Young asked Spotify to...
take his music off, right.
Take his music off because they have a podcast from Rogan, who has certain views of a vaccination, etc. Then you have here something that it's not that, let's say, that banal. I mean, okay, we're talking about music, one thing, and then we are talking about someone who does interviews and a podcast. And then now we have some kind of public debate about who is right. But I mean, it goes beyond music, or it goes beyond the podcast. It is about public health also. It's a debate about public health. But then you have emotions attached to this debate. Who is in favor of Young, who is in favor of Rogan. And you have all these debate, and even I saw a tag now, it's kind of cancel Spotify or something like that, whatever. Okay. I think these kind of emotions, this kind of, I'm not talking just certainly about journalism, but journalism could play or will play a role in this debate. is kind of shaping not only the view or the assessment about just the aesthetics of the value of Neil Young music or whatever, but it's also a debate about public health, somewhat.
Well, it's also a debate about who distributes information and when is information valid or not. And these
Yes,
all
I mean, exactly. You have many layers, but all of them are kind of mediated by highly emotional views on the issues.
Yeah.
And totally, there is an element of aesthetics on top of that, because it's also a way of, I mean, you like or not Neil Young, wherever you are, you feel some kind of attachment to his music. And then there is another consideration, which is kind of an aesthetic appreciation of the artist. Even Eric Clapton, I mean, Eric Clapton is completely out of his mind regarding vaccination, I know, but still one of the best guitar players. I mean, and then you leave these kind of things. But I mean, that's just to give you an example what I mean by emotion and aesthetics. And I think we tend to dismiss that because I'm not a former, I'm a journalist also, I'm a professor, but also I still write and do things. And I also attended School of Journalism and Communication, and the idea was, okay, let's be rational, let's be objective, or let's follow these ethics, whatever, always with the idea of taking away from the business any emotional consideration. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
The reality is that first, you cannot take away that, which is completely silly to think that you are kind of a robot reporting or whatever. It's not true. But the other thing is that there is always, either in the writing, in the images, an element of aesthetics, always.
Excuse me, Isaac, I think
I know.
I'm going to ask you to get Michelle's email and then continue this conversation.
Yes, no problem.
Like at another time.
Okay.
I think, Michelle, if you're still up to it, we have another question in the chat from Stephanie. So Stephanie asked, how do types of journalism fit within the way journalism is defined? Take, for example, scientific journalism, and does these types of journalism take on different roles, tasks, objectives, values, as you explained, statements in your opinion?
I think there's I think you need to distinguish between beat journalism. So for example, I'd call scientific journalism, it's more of a beat journalism in that it focuses on an area of expertise. So like if you're a crime reporter, a scientific reporter, the space reporter, health reporter, those are expertise beats. Whereas we're starting to see a lot of different types of journalism but they are more aligned with practice. So there's peace journalism was what was mentioned in the last one. And there is solutions journalism, constructive journalism, participatory journalism. So these don't revolve around specific beats, but they revolve more around practices. I mean, at this point, I'm not sure I want to say anything about how journalism is defined because I don't know. I am partial to Jeff Jarvis's definition, which is kind of this broad idea that it is in journalism is in service to helping people better understand the world they live in. You can pick that apart for good or for bad. But I think that when you're talking about a beat specifically, your kind of standards or your understanding of what journalism is should be the same across all of those beats. It shouldn't vary whether I'm a scientific reporter or a criminal reporter or a health reporter or an environmental reporter. I think that, and I think most journalists would agree in practice that your standards are typically still aligned across those. It's when you move to these different journalism approaches that you might see variations in how journalism is being defined and what a journalist is supposed to do, and especially around questions of bias and objectivity and advocacy and whether you kind of introduce yourself into the situation or not. I think that's where you see variations.
thank you, Michelle. So we got gone over our time for about 10 minutes. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming. We'll be back tomorrow at 9:30?
9:30, yeah.
9:30. So have a great evening.
Thank you,
Michelle.
everyone.
Elise, may I ask you a question? We can stop the recording. It's just a question of organization for tomorrow.